Good day to you. Have you heard the news? Yeah, I bet that made you come closer, didn't it? Have you heard the news? It's easy to forget what is at the basis of that question, though, which is new, right? Because that has become a whole way that human beings interact with each other when we are trying to take in media content that we consider to be new stuff that is reported by somebody who has some expertise. And the new stuff that we are learning is telling us about our world, something that we're interested in. So, what is news? This is what CNN is saying is news right now. They're talking about a powerful telescope that's being designed. I don't know much about the story. I'm seeing it for the first time myself, but that's what they're saying is news. Technology progress, I guess you could say, is the category for that kind of news. Here's what Yahoo says is news. The top story Yahoo is saying is news is a sports story. The NFL's chief medical officer makes claim about COVID, followed by a model says she was uninvited from her friend's wedding after looking too good in the bridesmaid dress the bride chose for her, followed by new hybrid driver splits the fairway every time. Oh, no, wait, that's an advertisement. See how that snuck in there? Again, American media are a business. And then this woman's date sent her home in an Uber because he was too embarrassed to be seen with her in the outfit she was wearing. Okay, so that's entertainment news, right? That's what Yahoo News is saying is news is entertainment. So that's what we're taking on today. In Chapter 5, we're taking on the news business. We're talking about this area of content that we access more so when you're older. You tend to access news when you're older, except if you're looking at entertainment news or sports news when you're younger. But more so, news is something that you start to get into when you hit those 20s. You're starting to work and life becomes a little bit more serious. It's not the case for everybody. So let's look at the news business. And the chapter actually starts out with a fact that you may not know about, and that is that newspapers and other news organizations as well are actually often owned by famous people. In the case of the Washington Post, which is a long-standing newspaper in this country, which has had a tradition of investigative journalism, it actually brought down a president in the United States, President Nixon, because of the Watergate scandal. The Washington Post today is owned by Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon. The multi-billion-dollar Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. What does that mean? Can the Post report objectively on any product that Amazon sells? That's something that you'll have to decide because he owns that. So let's move to the invention of the modern printing press. We want to circle back to that. We talked about it last class, but it has a lot to do with our class today because the modern printing press, the Gutenberg printing press, is what made possible the dissemination of newspapers. These ideas that you could open up loose leaves. They weren't bound like a book. You didn't have a hard binding and you didn't have chapters, but you had like single sheets of paper, which would be newsletters, and then later on newspapers, right? So the very first English-speaking newspaper was Coranto, and it was not in the United States or England. Coranto is in 1618. That's a long time ago, 1618 in Amsterdam. Amsterdam, if you've been there, I've been there many times, has people sailing into its port from all over the world, and English became the language of currency, of the way that people would communicate, so that newspaper grew up in that environment. It was a broadsheet newspaper. You have to fold it open. It opens wide, right? And you first fold it this way and then fold it this way. That's a broadsheet newspaper, and it focused mostly on British and foreign news. During this time period, the 1600s, newspapers were not free to operate like they are today. Not that they're totally free to operate, but basically European governments tried to control newspapers in the 1600s because they were afraid that they were going to plant ideas about getting rid of the aristocracy, the kingdoms that were in place, and replacing it with something else like capitalism. And so European governments tried to control newspapers. Over on the United States side of things, one of the very first newspapers, actually the very first newspaper, was called Public Occurrences. That word public spelled with a CK at the end, in the United States in 1690. So we go way back, even before we were a country, with a newspaper. And that newspaper was shut down. It was shut down because it was shut down by the American government, New England government. It was shut down because in that newspaper, Public Occurrences, there were disparaging remarks made about the King of France. That just wasn't done. It wasn't done, so it was shut down, and that's how newspapers were controlled. That's, again, there was a fear of overthrowing aristocracy with a different form of operating. So let's highlight some other names here. James Franklin was the brother of Ben Franklin. James Franklin, he had a newspaper called the New England Courant, which in 1721 was also irritating the authorities with its criticism, the government elected officials. And guess what happened? He was thrown in jail. He was thrown in jail in New England. And his brother Ben took over the newspaper at 16. So that's where Ben Franklin got his start in the newspaper publishing business, and one could say in the media business, Ben Franklin being a mogul. And he used that experience to purchase the Pennsylvania Gazette, which we talked about last class. Pennsylvania Gazette, which, by the way, was the most influential newspaper in the American colonies. It's what you looked to find out what was happening in the struggle against the United Kingdom. By the way, this newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, was also the first one to publish a cartoon and a weather report. So we're seeing the idea of new as a product, news, new being at the basis of news, being expanded to other areas here. Now let's talk about the penny press. We've talked about the penny press in this class before. Newspapers in American colonies, we already made that point last class, they were not like they are today. They're not general interests. You don't have sports in them. You don't have lifestyle stuff. You don't have business. American newspapers were originally just shipping news and political essays. Very elite subjects, and that's what newspapers were designed for people who had money and who could read, and that wasn't everybody. And most newspapers, furthermore, were underwritten by political parties. So if you're reading a newspaper, there's no sense of objectivity. It's about what is this newspaper, which is underwritten by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, what is it saying that is also going to promote the beliefs of those two parties? So newspapers were very, very different. They were expensive to purchase, and the average person didn't read them. All of that changed, though. All of that changed with the penny press, which was made possible because of the Gutenberg Printing Press. That's that invention that makes it possible to hand stamp out pages, which was then motorized by a steam engine and then later electricity. And that's how you get this fast production of newspapers. So now what we're going to do is we're going to highlight Benjamin Day. Benjamin Day, he founded a newspaper in New York City, a penny press newspaper called the New York Sun. The New York Sun. You can look at it as a forerunner of tabloid newspapers today because he did quite a few things that started to get that look of a tabloid newspaper. His newspaper was in 1833. And in that year, he founded the New York Sun, and he came up with a slogan for the newspaper. First time newspapers had used slogans, and he called it, "It Shines for You." Every edition of the New York Sun, it shines for you. Like this newspaper is shining a spotlight on corruption, crime, and everything else that people need to know about. If the newspaper wasn't there, the light wouldn't be shown there. And actually, if you look across the world, you'll see a lot of newspapers with that title, Sun, inside of them, including the most popular selling newspaper in England, in Britain, which is the Sun. So Benjamin Day started pumping out this, and he started also to emphasize facts over opinions. Now, why is that? It's because newspaper news was starting to be funded more by advertising and less by subsidies from political parties and less by subscriptions. When you have advertising funding a newspaper, advertisers don't want to piss people off with content that's against their political beliefs. So the content starts to become more neutral, more factual in Benjamin Day's newspapers, and because of industrialization, creating the mass production of newspapers and the influx of advertising into newspapers. Other newspapers followed Benjamin Day's newspaper, like the Critic, the Herald, and the Star, all sold for a penny. The advertisers, that's what made it possible. And the concept of news itself became a product during this time period. And the news expanded to other areas which were not so laden with at least on the surface, not so laden with opinions. So you start to see news covering the police, the courts, and basically what's happening on the streets. And that's where we get the coverage of crime as a product, news as a product covering crime. And so objectivity starts to become an important part of news as well. It starts to become a value that we hold. That paper's not objective, therefore I don't like it. That's the way that we think today. And so the penny press gave us a concept of news, and news also then starts to present neutral, factual, supposedly opinions. Now let's go to a kind of war that took place. in the context of yellow journalism. Have you heard of that before, yellow journalism? We're going to discuss what that is in a moment, but let's talk about these two people who are kind of at war with each other. I mean, really, they were business competitors, right? They were really media moguls going head to head against each other to get the biggest audience. The first one we want to talk about is Joseph Pulitzer. Joseph Pulitzer, I hope you recognize that name as in Pulitzer Prize. Joseph Pulitzer was Austrian. You know that country, Austria, in Europe? He came from Austria to fight in the U.S. Civil War. He was fighting in the U.S. Civil War, and actually what he ended up becoming was becoming a reporter for a German language newspaper. And he used that experience and also the money that he accumulated after the war to purchase his own newspaper. In 1878, he bought the St. Louis Post and Dispatch, and he became the publisher, 1878, and he grew that circulation, just to show how successful he was, from 15,000 all the way to 250,000. 15,000 to 250,000, more than tenfold. Amazing. But he had his eyes set on bigger sites. He wanted the New York market. So what he did in 1883 was he bought a newspaper in the New York City market, where there were many more people, much more chance to make money off of advertising. He bought a paper called the New York World, and he turned it around. He changed the appearance. He made the newspaper way more dramatic, with big headlines and photos. He came up with the above the fold concept. You know what that is? Is the paper has two dimensions to it. You open it up, right? And whatever's above the fold, that's the story. That's the most important story. That's the monumental story, the big story with the big headlines. It's the big headlines, the active verbs, the easy to understand words. And what started to happen was immigrants in New York City. You know, immigrants coming to New York City as part of industrialization. They see an opportunity in the United States to come work here. They're coming in from Italy and Germany and Ireland in the early parts of our country. Later on, eastern parts of Europe is Slovakia and Poland and Russia, and even to the current age, later on Asia on the West Coast, and then even the current age, Latinos. So we have a history of immigrants coming in. New York City had a situation where immigrants were looking to newspapers to learn the language of America and to learn the culture of the United States. Newspapers played that big role. So the wording, the vocabulary in American newspapers came way down. It had to be simple, otherwise somebody from Italy and somebody from another country that didn't speak English wouldn't be able to understand. And so we have a lot of things going on just by virtue of industrialization now is changing the way that media are being delivered. Pulitzer did other things as well, though. He also made the Sunday edition an institution. The Sunday newspaper was such a big deal in my household and many others. It's gone by the wayside for the most part now. It was the same newspaper you got during the week, but it was thicker. It had a lot more cartoons, had grocery store advertisements, it had feature stories, and families would their whole morning was organized around breakfast and that newspaper taken apart. There was something in it for everybody. So you can say that Joseph Pulitzer gave us that. Also, Joseph Pulitzer gave women readers, he gave them romance and fiction. So for the first time, women are starting to be considered as an audience, a targeted audience. And in fact, advertisers wanted that. Advertisers wanted women to read their newspaper, to read the newspapers they were advertising. And because the American model, for the most part, and this is still true, in most American households, the woman is the domestic manager of the finances. In other words, she controls the purchases. And maybe not most, but many households. And that was the case behind the thinking of going after more women readers with romance and fiction. And also Pulitzer included a female very often in his newspapers. She was a famous journalist because she was a stunt journalist. That means she would pull stunts to get the story. Her name was Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly, Nellie. She was a stunt journalist, and her most famous journalistic adventure was penetrating an insane asylum by getting herself committed to the insane asylum as a patient. And she went in there and she reported on what the conditions were like inside of an insane asylum. We don't even call them insane asylums anymore. She worked for many newspapers, by the way, and she often covered women in factories to expose the plight of women working in sewing factories 12 hours a day and poor lighting, etc. And you can kind of say that she helped develop, even though this was not necessarily what she was intending to do, she helped to develop sensationalism. You know, the idea of a really outrageous story being the main story in a newspaper. All right, so all of that was because of Joseph Pulitzer. Well, along comes another person who wants to compete with him, and his name is William Randolph Hearst. He has three names to his name. William Randolph Hearst. He came differently from a wealthy family in San Francisco, and he decided also that he wanted to enter the market after he tried his hand with the San Francisco Examiner, where he was the editor. He also wanted to come to New York City. That's where the action was. So he came to New York City, and he purchased the New York Journal. And then he started to go head to head with Pulitzer's newspaper with the New York Journal. So you have this war that started. It's called Yellow Journalism. It's named after a cartoon that used to run in both newspapers where the yellow kid was the main actor in that cartoon. So it's not yellow journalism because newspapers get older. It's yellow journalism because of the yellow kid. And each newspaper basically tried to outdo the other with headlines and sensationalism. It was really about the outrageous. And a good example of that is the United States was at war with Spain, and there was a fury over Cuba, which at that time was Spanish property, and this tension between Spain and America was always drummed up by the newspapers, really make people thinking that a war was going on. In fact, there's a famous story where William Randolph Hearst called up one of his reporters who was in a boat in the Caribbean looking for action in the so-called Spanish-American War outside of Cuba, and the reporter said, "There's nothing going on. I have nothing to report." And William Randolph Hearst said, "You supply me the photos and we'll supply the war." In other words, all this reporter had to do was take some photos and back to the newspaper, and they would create a whole story about a war that didn't really exist. So I do want to tell you that Joseph Pulitzer, he really, really regretted what had happened. He was very upset about what he had contributed to, and that is why he founded the Columbia School of Journalism, which is still a high mark of a journalistic master's degree today in New York City, the Columbia University and the Columbia School of University, founded by Pulitzer, and that's also why the journalistic profession rewards journalists today with the Pulitzer Prize. That's where that comes from, the Pulitzer Prize. There are many different prizes for many different categories of news writing, feature writing, hard news writing, etc. That's where that comes from. Let's talk about magazines now. Magazines also are in the same kind of domain as newspapers. They both are periodical. Magazines come out less. Both are paper, very disposable, go in the recycle. They're both very current. Magazines were a very big part of the American landscape early on. Very, very early on, magazines were it. Today, magazines are still finding it hard to compete with online news, and many magazines, of course, are just strictly online today. What magazines have going for them is photojournalism. Photojournalism, the ability of a photograph to tell a story. And the technology that's made that possible, that was invented, is called the halftone. The halftone is just like dots on the screen. And if you look really closely, can't see anything, but you pull back farther away, and subtly, ironically, the farther away you pull from a halftone, the more it comes into focus. But that's what made the ability to print using printing press technology, to print photographs in newspapers and magazines and even books. And so one of the most famous photojournalists was Matthew Brady. And here's a good example of photojournalism. He photographed dead soldiers in the Civil War. He photographed black people and white people laying next to each other. He photographed Southerners and Northerners laying next to each other. He photographed brothers laying next to each other. His photojournalism was extremely powerful and probably could be said to have helped accelerate the end of the war. Other kinds of journalists that we want to talk about who employ this technology are muckrakers. Muckrakers are another kind of journalist. They are investigative reporters. The most famous investigative reporter, trying to uncover wrongdoing, uncover corruption, look underneath a stone that somebody hasn't looked under before. That's what investigative journal is. The early muckraker, one of the early muckrakers was Samuel McClure. In fact, his whole magazine, Muckrakers, was all about muckraking. And his favorite targets of his news muckraking, which included photos, was taking on insurance companies and railroad companies and oil companies, the most famous of which was Standard Oil, always trying to uncover corruption or price gouging or injuries that weren't reported or anything else that was wrong at Standard Oil and all these other companies. That's what muckraking, and it performs a powerful piece of journalism, does it not? Would we ever find corruption if we didn't have muckrakers? Yet another magazine that really accelerated or became accelerated because of halftones and photojournalism was Time, the Time magazine, and then Life magazine, and the whole Time Life empire, media empire, as it became a company that owned these magazines, founded by Henry Luce. We mentioned him last time. Henry Luce, that missionary, son of missionary parents that went to China. And the other magazines that use photographs are Fortune, Life, and Sports Illustrated. They're more photograph-based than they are text-based. Let's now move to talking about a completely different facet of news, and that's going to be broadcast news. So it's impossible to talk about newspapers without talking about the development of radio stations and TV to some extent, because they came on the scene in 1920 when newspapers were very, very big, and radio and TV created competition for newspapers. Now, we're not talking about radio today. We're not talking about television. We have whole separate classes on those with different chapters, but we do need to introduce them today, right? So the very first radio stations started competing with newspapers in 1920, and guess where the first radio station was? Right here in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. KDKA was the name of that radio station in Pittsburgh, and it broadcast the election returns. 1920 was the date. Harding and Cox were the two candidates. Basically, the company put a transmitter on top of a building and said, let's broadcast this to as many people who can receive the signal as we can and see what happens. And it happened to be a news broadcast. It wasn't sports. It wasn't music. Newspapers in general, they owned radio stations, and they started to see the threat of radio stations because people would want news as they could hear it live, right? And they would want news that has the sounds from the field, like a police siren or something. And so radio offered an edge that newspapers didn't. I mean, you had to wait every morning for the next news. And so newspapers tried to cut off newswire services to radio stations. They tried to cut off. The way that radio stations got their news was from newswires, people out in the field, and they're working for newswire organizations, and they sell their news to newspapers and radio stations, and so they tried to stop that. And then they even tried to tell newspapers, no, you can't deliver news. It's international. Only we can do that, and all these other restrictions. And TV basically said, fuck off. I mean, I have to say it. I just have to say it like it is. We're going to form our own newsrooms. That's what radio did. And radio came on the scene as its own news distributor. Television also began on the scene, and not too far away from this time period. 1940s is when TV is invented. It doesn't really take off till the 50s. And then you start to have 15-minute newscasts to cover the world. Nightly network newscasts, 6:15 to 6:30, I think it was, or 6:30 to 6:45. Amazing, right? 15 minutes to cover the whole world. And then finally, those nightly network newscasts, we're talking about NBC, ABC, CBS, and Fox. Finally, those network newscasts went to half an hour in the 60s. And there was an anchor at that time, Walter Cronkite. That's his name, Walter Cronkite, Cronkite. He became an icon of the American family. He really did. He was voted the most trustworthy person in all of the United States. A news anchor. Amazing, right? Shows you how far objectivity came. Later on, color came to television. That really helped expand TV news and compete with newspapers. So let's go circle back now. Let's talk about the news business. How healthy is it? What's it looking like today? The newspaper part of things, not good. Newspapers are declining. Newspaper circulations are declining. They've been going out of business and getting thinner. The Pocono Record, local newspaper here, I had a column that I published in it for 3 years. It's where you get Rounding Some Corners from, actually. That newspaper column, it would not be there today. It's very thin today because they've lost the advertising support. It's gone over to Craigslist and to eBay and all the other places people that can sell stuff. So newspapers are in a highly competitive environment, and most newspapers, they don't have natural competitors today because it's just not possible to support two newspapers in a market. Most small town dailies are monopolies, like the Pocono Record. However, on the national scene, newspapers are different. Newspapers are still really well respected. National newspapers still bring in a lot of revenue from advertising. National newspapers still make an impact when it comes to opinion leaders and influencing people so that they have opinions. Let's talk about the main ones. We've got the Wall Street Journal. That's located on Wall Street in New York. That's an investment street, right? That's where you have stockbrokers. And so this is a financial newspaper. It's the biggest newspaper in the U.S. for business and financial news. And guess who it's owned by? It's owned by the News Corporation. Remember from last class, Fox News, News Corporation, same company. The signature for this is it's conservative, but it does often bring in moderate to liberal opinions in its opinion pages. It tries to get some balance there. It's got an old look to it with a pen and ink look to it, like sketchings when they draw people instead of including photographs. Some tradition there. Let's go on to the next paper, which is USA Today. USA Today was originally designed to look like television. In fact, if you would buy a USA Today newspaper, it was in a stand that looked like a television. Today, it's become much more serious, but it has a lot of graphics, a lot of color, a lot of sports. USA Today has a very unique distribution strategy, at least for part of the market. They give it away for free in hotels to business travelers. You wake up in the morning, there's a USA Today there under your door. A lot of other newspapers adapted to USA Today with big color and with more color and graphics, so it had an impact on the whole market. Now we've got the New York Times. The closest newspaper to us here in East Stroudsburg, and it's the most prestigious newspaper in the United States. Its slogan is all the news that's fit to print. And what a masterful slogan. It's like if it's not in the New York Times, it's not news, right? The New York Times is known as liberal, but it also has conservatives that write in its opinion pages. Next up is the Washington Post. The Washington Post, we mentioned earlier, was bought by Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com. It's probably the most political newspaper. It has had that tradition. It did break the Watergate scandal. That's the name of a hotel in Washington, D.C., where Richard Nixon's operatives broke into the Democratic headquarters, and then they tried to cover it up. That's what that was all about. We also have the Los Angeles Times, the L.A. Times. That newspaper has won a lot of Pulitzer Prizes. Perhaps it's best known for including quotes from women and minorities in its newspaper in an effort to, quote, achieve mainstreaming. Mainstreaming was a concept of bringing groups that were otherwise othered. They were made to feel not part of American culture, bring them into daily news. All right, that now takes us to ethnic news, or the ethnic press, as it is also called. And ethnic news does have its place in American history. The Freedom Journal in 1827 was one of the very first black newspapers, and it tried to address the mistreatment of blacks. It was co-founded, the Freedom Journal, by John Russwurm, W-R-S-S-W-R-M. He was the first black person in the United States to get a college degree. And prior to this newspaper coming out, blacks did not exist. If they existed in newspapers, they existed only because they were the subject of a crime story. There's a crime story and the person is black. And they're mentioned because they're black, but the white person is not mentioned as being white. There's a lot of racism in newspapers, and as part of this class, this goal is to call out racism where it needs to be called out, and there is quite a bit of it in American media history. And this is another example of it, is blacks just were not covered as regular people. And so John Russwurm helped to change that. So did the North Star, another newspaper. The North Star in 1847 came out in Rochester, New York. This was published by a name you should know, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass of the Frederick Douglass Institute at ESU. And in fact, many universities have an FDI Institute, as they're called, Frederick Douglass Institute, which is an institute to help advance equality for African Americans. And the North Star was a very serious newspaper that published a lot on emancipation. It was about the freeing of slaves. Slaves were not free in 1847. We also have the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender, another newspaper, this one in 1905. This one was a yellow journalism newspaper, just like Pulitzer's newspaper and Hearst's newspaper. They actually used red headlines. And this newspaper did a lot of encouraging black people to move from the South to the North, where they could find equality and economic opportunity. And that's how you get Detroit being composed the way it is. So many African Americans moved to Detroit through efforts like the Chicago Defender to work. You also have Spanish language newspapers like the one out of Miami, El Nuevo Herald, which is the New Herald. And this is a companion to the Miami Herald. You can find Spanish small newspapers in most big cities. And then you have the gay press. The gay press, which has gone online now, but originally the Washington Blade was the oldest and biggest weekly gay newspaper, started in 1969. It helped move gay culture into the mainstream. It was also kind of mainstreaming like the LA Times. So where does that lead us to, the future of news? It's really hard to say. Newspapers are still viable, mostly at the national level, but most are failing. We do know that local news is something that will be continued to be supplied by local newspapers. That's something you can't get from a national newspaper. And we know that newspapers will be online in some way, shape, or form. Other than that, news is yet to be defined in this age. Have a great day.